late grandfather's house and, for the first time, decided to open the old garage they had been forbidden to approach since childhood. What they found inside forever changed the way they saw their past and their grandfather. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The road leading to the old house unfolded slowly, as if unwilling to release what waited at its end. It curved through fields that had long since stopped being fields in any living sense, through tree lines that had grown denser and darker over the years, and past familiar landmarks whose meaning had softened with time but never fully disappeared. The journey itself felt less like travel and more like a passage, a quiet crossing from the present into something suspended and unfinished. 3 months had passed since their grandfather's death, yet the weight of it had not settled. It lingered in the chest, unshaped and unresolved, as if grief itself had been waiting for this moment. They had delayed the visit longer than they should have. Practical reasons had provided convenient shelter: work, distance, paperwork, the slow mechanics of inheritance. But beneath all of that lay something unspoken. The house was not merely a property to be assessed. It was a place where time had once moved according to a different rhythm, where days had been measured by seasons and habits rather than schedules. Returning meant stepping back into a version of themselves that no longer existed, and into the quiet orbit of a man whose presence had shaped their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. When the car finally stopped at the edge of the property, silence closed around them with surprising force. The air seemed thicker here, heavier with moisture and the scent of earth. The yard stretched out ahead, overgrown and uneven, no longer restrained by the routines that had once kept it in order. Grass rose past the ankles, bending lazily under its own weight. Narrow paths that had once been clear were now only suggestions, faint lines where feet had once passed regularly. Trees leaned inward, their branches interlacing overhead, filtering sunlight into scattered fragments that trembled on the ground. The house stood exactly where it always had, yet it felt altered by absence. Its walls bore no dramatic scars, no signs of collapse or neglect severe enough to demand immediate attention. Instead, it carried the subtler mark of abandonment, the kind that comes not from destruction but from stillness. Windows reflected the trees without revealing what lay inside. The porch boards creaked faintly beneath their steps, responding as if surprised to be noticed again. Crossing the threshold brought with it a shift that was impossible to ignore. The interior air was cool and dry, carrying the mixed scents of old wood, dust, and something faintly herbal, as though remnants of dried plants still lingered in the walls. Light entered reluctantly, threading through curtains that had not been moved in months. Each room seemed frozen in mid-thought. Furniture stood exactly where it had been left. Objects remained where hands had last set them down. Nothing felt staged or preserved, yet nothing had decayed beyond recognition either. It was as if the house itself had paused, waiting. Moving through the rooms awakened memories that surfaced without warning. A chair by the window still bore the shallow indentation where he used to sit in the evenings. A small table near the door held a stack of old newspapers, their edges yellowed and curling. In the kitchen, a cupboard door hung slightly askew, the hinge worn but familiar. These were not remarkable things, yet each carried the quiet authority of repetition, of years lived according to habits so consistent they had become invisible. They began the work they had come for, though the word work felt inadequate. Papers were gathered, drawers opened, shelves examined. Documents related to ownership and maintenance lay mixed with personal notes, receipts, and folded envelopes whose contents were no longer relevant to anyone but memory. The process was slow, interrupted often by pauses that had nothing to do with fatigue. Handling these items felt intrusive, as though they were trespassing not on property, but on moments that had never been meant for anyone else. Despite the effort to remain practical, a sense of unease accompanied every movement. The house resisted categorization. It refused to be reduced to an inventory. Each object carried with it the suggestion of a story that would never fully reveal itself. Even the smallest item seemed charged with intention. A pocket knife placed carefully on a shelf, its blade cleaned and folded. A pair of worn gloves tucked into a drawer, the leather softened by years of use. These were not things abandoned carelessly. They were things left behind deliberately, as though their owner had expected to return. As the afternoon light shifted, the sense of time passing became more pronounced. Shadows lengthened along the walls, stretching across familiar surfaces in unfamiliar ways. It was then that something beyond the house itself began to assert its presence. Through one of the side windows, partially obscured by branches and leaves, a darker shape could be seen at the far edge of the property. It was indistinct at first, blending easily into the surrounding growth. Only after several moments did its outline resolve into something recognizable. The garage stood apart from the main structure, positioned near the tree line where the land dipped slightly. It had always been there, though rarely acknowledged. As children, they had been made aware of it not through explanation but through instruction. They had been told not to go near it, not to ask questions, not to treat it as a place of curiosity. The rule had been enforced quietly but absolutely, with a firmness that left no room for negotiation. Over time, the garage had faded into the background of their memory, becoming less a location and more a concept, defined primarily by absence. Seeing it again stirred something unsettled. The structure appeared older than the house itself, its outline softened by vegetation that had claimed it over the years. Vines climbed its sides, gripping the wood with determined persistence. Bushes crowded its entrance, their branches tangled and thorned. The doors were barely visible beneath layers of growth and accumulated dirt. Even from a distance, it looked sealed, not merely closed but withdrawn from use. The sight of it introduced a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the visit. The house, for all its stillness, felt accessible. Its rooms had welcomed their presence without resistance. The garage, by contrast, seemed to push back. It existed on the edge of the property both physically and symbolically, separated not by distance but by intent. It was clear that whatever lay within it had been deliberately kept apart from the rest of the household. They returned their attention to the tasks at hand, attempting to maintain focus on what could be seen and handled. Yet the awareness of the garage lingered, threading itself into every thought. The memory of the prohibition resurfaced with unexpected clarity. It had not been accompanied by anger or fear, only certainty. The message had been simple. That place was not meant for them. As evening approached, they moved more slowly, the weight of the day pressing down. Fatigue mingled with a growing sense of incompleteness. The house had offered fragments, traces of a life lived carefully and quietly, but the presence of the garage suggested that there was more, something unaccounted for, something that had shaped the man they had known without ever being named. When they finally stepped back outside, the light was beginning to soften. The sun hovered lower in the sky, casting a warmer hue across the overgrown yard. In that light, the garage seemed to retreat further into shadow, its outline darkening as the surrounding foliage glowed briefly before dusk. The contrast made it impossible to ignore. They stood there longer than necessary, neither moving toward it nor away from it. The day had not provided answers, only questions that now felt heavier than before. The house had revealed itself willingly, offering memories and objects without resistance. The garage remained silent, closed, and watchful. As night began to settle, a quiet understanding took shape. This visit was not complete. What they had come for had not yet been found. The return to the house was only the beginning, and whatever awaited them next lay not within its walls, but beyond them, behind doors that had been closed for decades, and a silence that had been carefully maintained. The shadow of the garage stretched across the yard, lengthening with the fading light, and with it came the unmistakable sense that the true story had yet to begin. The night passed uneasily, as if the land itself refused to rest. Even from inside the house, the presence of the garage pressed against their thoughts, shaping the silence into something alert and unresolved. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by half-formed images and sensations rather than dreams. When morning arrived, it did so quietly, filtered through branches and leaves that softened the light before it reached the windows. The house seemed unchanged, yet the atmosphere within it had shifted. What had been merely abandoned the day before now felt guarded, as though the property had taken note of their return and was waiting to see what they would do next. They resumed their work with deliberate calm, moving through the rooms once more, gathering what had been left unfinished. But the rhythm of their actions lacked the aimless quality of the previous day. Every movement carried an underlying awareness, a gravitational pull toward the edge of the property. The garage no longer existed as a distant silhouette. It had become a destination, even if one they had not yet acknowledged openly. The more they attempted to focus on ordinary tasks, the clearer it became that those tasks were only a pretext. What they truly needed lay elsewhere. The prohibition that had surrounded the garage during their childhood returned with surprising force. It had never been dramatic or violent. There had been no threats, no raised voices. The rule had been delivered once, perhaps twice, and that had been enough. The certainty with which it had been stated left no room for curiosity to grow unchecked. As children, they had learned to associate the garage not with mystery, but with boundaries. It was simply a place they were not meant to enter, no more questionable than a locked drawer or a closed door marked private. Yet, the memory of that rule carried with it an emotional residue that had outlasted its relevance. Even now, standing as adults on land that legally belonged to them, the idea of approaching the garage produced a physical response. The body remembered what the mind had long dismissed. A tightening in the chest, a faint hesitation in the step, the echo of an instinct learned too early to be fully erased. It was not fear exactly, but a deeply ingrained respect, shaped by years of trust in the man who had set the rule. The garage itself seemed to respond to their attention, emerging more clearly as they moved through the yard. In daylight, its condition was impossible to ignore. Time had settled heavily upon it, marking every surface with evidence of neglect that was not accidental, but cumulative. The wooden walls were darkened by moisture, their grain swollen and uneven. Nails protruded at irregular angles, their heads rusted and flaking. The roof sagged slightly under the weight of leaves and debris that had gathered there season after season. Vegetation had claimed the structure with remarkable persistence. Thorned bushes crowded the base of the walls, their branches woven together in dense patterns that resisted easy separation. Vines crept upward, disappearing beneath the roof line, their tendrils embedded so deeply that they seemed less like growths and more like veins. Moss spread across the lower panels, blurring the line between wood and earth. The garage did not merely sit on the land. It appeared anchored to it, held in place by forces older and more patient than human intention. The doors were barely distinguishable from the surrounding growth. What once might have been painted a lighter color had long since darkened, the surface cracked and peeling beneath layers of dirt and organic matter. The metal fittings were corroded to the point of near invisibility. Even from a short distance, it was clear that these doors had not been opened in many years. The silence around them felt intentional, as though the structure had been designed to discourage attention. Standing before it brought with it a sense of transgression that felt disproportionate to the act itself. This was, after all, just a garage, a utilitarian building on private land. And yet, the way it had been set apart, the care with which it had been excluded from daily life, imbued it with a significance that resisted rational explanation. The place seemed to exist in a category of its own, neither part of the house nor entirely separate from it. The practical considerations that had driven their visit resurfaced with renewed urgency. Documents still needed to be organized. The condition of the property had to be assessed honestly. Leaving any structure unopened was not an option if they intended to move forward. The law made no allowances for sentiment. Ownership demanded responsibility, and responsibility demanded knowledge. Whatever lay within the garage, it was now theirs to confront. Even so, the decision to approach it was not made lightly. They lingered at a distance, their gazes drawn repeatedly toward the overgrown doors and then away again, as if expecting the building to react. The land around it was quieter than the rest of the yard, the usual sounds of insects and birds dampened, as though the natural world itself observed a kind of boundary there. The air felt cooler, heavier, carrying the faint scent of damp wood and soil. Memory layered itself over perception. Images from childhood surfaced unbidden, not of the garage itself, but of moments that had followed any mention of it. A subtle shift in their grandfather's demeanor, a narrowing of focus, the way he would redirect attention without explanation, guiding them elsewhere with firm gentleness. At the time, they had accepted it without question. Now, as adults, the absence of an explanation felt more significant than any rule ever could have been. The internal conflict intensified as they stood there. Respect for the past pulled in one direction, curiosity and necessity in another. It was not merely a question of what they might find, but of what they might lose by finding it. The image of their grandfather that had lived in their minds for years was stable and uncomplicated. He had been quiet, disciplined, devoted to routine. He had loved them in a reserved but unwavering way. Whatever secrets the garage held had the potential to complicate that image, to introduce contradictions that could not easily be reconciled. At the same time, leaving the garage untouched would mean accepting a permanent gap in understanding. The unanswered question would linger, shaping every memory with its absence. The property could be sold, the house emptied, but the uncertainty would remain, carried forward into whatever life came next. It became clear that the choice was not between opening the garage and preserving the past, but between confronting the truth and living indefinitely with its shadow. Preparation became a way to delay the inevitable while still moving toward it. They gathered what tools they could find, selecting items with care, as though the manner of entry mattered as much as the act itself. gloves worn thin by age, a flashlight whose beam flickered before stabilizing, a length of metal heavy enough to apply force but narrow enough to fit into a tight space. Each object was tested, adjusted, set aside with intention. As these preparations unfolded, a strange calm began to replace the earlier tension. The mind, once committed to action, seemed to release its grip on doubt. The garage ceased to be an abstract symbol and became a physical reality, something that could be approached, examined, opened. The weight of anticipation remained, but it was tempered now by purpose. They returned to the doors and stood close enough to touch them. Up close, the damage was even more apparent. The wood was soft in places, yielding slightly beneath pressure. The metal latch, what little could be seen of it, was thick with rust, its edges blurred by corrosion. It was clear that opening the garage would require effort, and that effort would be both physical and emotional. For a moment, they did nothing. The air was still. Sunlight filtered through the leaves overhead, casting uneven patterns across the doors. In that quiet, the presence of their grandfather felt closest, not as a memory, but as an influence, a guiding force that had shaped this moment long before they were aware of it. The rule he had set, the silence he had maintained, the care with which he had kept this place apart, all converged here. The decision, once made, did not announce itself with clarity. It arrived subtly, in the alignment of intent and movement. Hands reached forward. Tools were positioned. The boundary that had held for decades was about to be tested, not out of defiance, but out of a need to understand. The forbidden place had been acknowledged, approached, and prepared for. What remained was to cross the threshold and accept whatever awaited on the other side. As they leaned in, the weight of the moment settled fully upon them. The past, long contained behind these doors, was about to press forward into the present. The garage stood silent, unyielding, its secrets intact for now. But the space between intention and action had narrowed to nothing, and the next movement would carry them beyond the point of hesitation, into a chapter that could no longer be postponed. The moment that followed the quiet preparation felt suspended, stretched thin between intention and consequence. The garage stood before them exactly as it had moments earlier, unchanged in form yet altered by the simple fact that it was no longer merely observed. It had been chosen. The air around it seemed denser now, as though the land itself recognized that a boundary was about to be disturbed. There was no dramatic shift, no sudden sound or movement to mark the transition. Instead, everything slowed, and the smallest details gained weight. The first contact with the overgrowth was tentative. Thorned branches resisted being moved aside, bending only to snap back into place as if defending the structure behind them. Leaves shook loose and fell to the ground, releasing a faint, sharp scent. The vines clung stubbornly to the wood, their roots embedded so deeply that pulling them free required patience rather than force. Each motion demanded attention, not because it was difficult, but because it felt deliberate, as though the act of clearing the entrance itself carried meaning. Time seemed to lose its usual shape. Minutes passed unnoticed as they worked, hands growing sore beneath the gloves, fabric catching on thorns, skin prickling despite the layers of protection. The physical strain was steady and unremarkable, yet it produced an unexpected clarity. There was no room for speculation while the body focused on the task. Each branch removed, each vine loosened, brought the doors a little more into view, stripping away years of concealment piece by piece. As the entrance slowly emerged, the garage revealed its age without restraint. The wood beneath the vegetation was dark and swollen, its surface uneven where moisture had penetrated deep into the grain. The outline of the doors became clearer, their edges warped and misaligned. The threshold was no longer hypothetical. It was real, tangible, standing there in full view, waiting. With the foliage cleared back as much as possible, the metal latch came into focus. It was heavier than expected, thick with corrosion that dulled its shape and softened its edges. Rust flaked away at the slightest touch, falling in brittle fragments to the ground below. The mechanism looked less like something designed to be opened and more like a seal, a final statement made in iron and time. It had not been maintained, but neither had it been allowed to decay entirely. It had endured. They examined it closely, testing it without commitment. The metal did not move. Even gentle pressure produced only a dull resistance, accompanied by a faint grinding sound that carried an unpleasant finality. It was clear that the latch would not yield to subtlety. Whatever lay beyond it would require force to reach. The weight of that realization settled slowly. This was no longer a matter of turning a handle or lifting a door. To proceed meant to break something that had been intentionally left intact. The distinction mattered. The rule from childhood echoed faintly, not as a voice, but as a sensation, a pause that crept into the muscles and slowed the hands. The body remembered restraint even as the mind insisted on necessity. The tool chosen for the task felt uncomfortably heavy once lifted. Its cold surface bit into the palm through the glove, grounding the moment in physical reality. Positioning it between the latch and the door required precision. The space was narrow, the angle awkward, the metal uncooperative. Each adjustment brought the tool closer to its purpose, narrowing the distance between preparation and action. For a brief moment, everything stopped. The surrounding yard seemed to recede, the sounds of insects and distant birds fading into something indistinct. The garage filled the field of awareness entirely. The doors stood silent, unresponsive, their surfaces marked by decades of exposure. This was the last point at which hesitation was possible, the final instant in which the threshold remained uncrossed. When pressure was finally applied, it was measured and cautious at first. The tool strained against the latch, producing a low, strained sound that vibrated faintly through the wood. Nothing gave. The resistance was absolute, as though the garage itself refused to acknowledge the attempt. A second application of force followed, stronger this time, accompanied by a sharp metallic groan that cut through the quiet. The sound lingered in the air longer than expected, echoing faintly against the trees. It was not loud, but it was definitive, a clear violation of the silence that had settled over the place for so long. The latch shifted slightly, enough to confirm that it could be moved, that the boundary was not immutable. The realization brought with it a strange mixture of relief and unease. More pressure followed, steady and relentless. The metal protested loudly now, rusted joints grinding against each other, the latch bending just enough to suggest imminent failure. The doors trembled faintly, dust falling from their edges in fine streams. The effort required grew heavier with each movement, muscles tightening as force was transferred from body to tool, from tool to metal. Then, without warning, the resistance broke. The sound was sharp and sudden, a violent snap that tore through the stillness and sent fragments of rust scattering across the ground. The latch gave way completely, collapsing inward with a final, hollow clang. The abruptness of it left a ringing sensation in the ears, as though the air itself had recoiled from the noise. For a moment, they did not move. The broken latch lay twisted and useless, no longer serving its purpose. The doors remained closed, but the seal had been broken. Something fundamental had shifted. The garage was no longer sealed by intention. It stood vulnerable, its long-held silence compromised. When the doors were finally pushed open, they resisted at first, reluctant to move after so many years of stillness. The wood creaked loudly, joints straining as they were forced to perform a function they had forgotten. The sound was deep and resonant, carrying the weight of age and disuse. Dust burst outward as the doors parted, rising into the air in thick clouds that caught the sunlight and transformed it into something hazy and dreamlike. The smell that followed was immediate and distinctive. It was not the stench of rot or decay as they had half expected, but something drier, more complex, a mixture of old wood, fine dust, and a faint, unmistakable trace of oil and resin. It was the scent of work, of materials handled carefully and repeatedly, of a space that had been lived in rather than abandoned. They stood at the threshold, unwilling to step inside too quickly. The interior was dim, a sudden contrast with the bright yard forcing their eyes to adjust slowly. Shapes emerged gradually from the darkness, first as vague outlines and then with increasing clarity. The space beyond the doors did not feel empty. It felt contained, as though everything within it had been waiting. As their vision sharpened, beams of sunlight pierced the interior through small gaps in the walls and roof, cutting through the dust-filled air in narrow shafts. The particles suspended in those beams moved lazily, drifting and settling in patterns that seemed almost intentional. The light revealed surfaces rather than illuminating the whole, offering glimpses rather than clarity. The threshold itself felt significant beneath their feet. The floor just inside the garage was worn smooth in places, marked by subtle grooves and depressions that suggested repeated movement. This was not a place that had been visited once and forgotten. It was a place that had known routine, repetition, and care. Stepping inside required another conscious decision. The air within was cooler, carrying a quiet stillness that contrasted sharply with the living sounds of the yard outside. The doors, left partially open, framed the exterior like a memory, the brightness beyond now feeling distant and unreal. The world had narrowed to this enclosed space and the quiet weight of what it contained. The first few steps were cautious, measured. Each footfall sounded louder than expected, echoing faintly against the walls. The floor responded solidly, reassuring in its stability. There was no sense of collapse or neglect beneath the surface. The garage had endured not through abandonment, but through preservation. As more of the interior came into focus, the initial shock of difference began to take hold. This was not the chaotic storage space they had imagined. There were no piles of discarded objects, no rusted machinery or broken furniture. Instead, there was order. Shelving lined the walls, their contents arranged with deliberate care. Surfaces were clear, tools set aside rather than scattered. The impression was immediate and unmistakable. This place had purpose. They paused again, standing just inside the doorway, absorbing the significance of what they were seeing. The threshold had been crossed, not just physically, but emotionally. The act of opening the garage had not revealed disorder or neglect. It had revealed intention, discipline, and something deeply personal. Behind them, the doors remained ajar, sunlight continuing to spill into the space, illuminating dust and wood and metal in soft, shifting patterns. Ahead of them, the interior waited in silence, holding its secrets intact but no longer inaccessible. The moment of entry marked the end of hesitation and the beginning of discovery. The past, long sealed away, had been invited forward. The barrier that had stood for decades lay broken behind them, and whatever had been kept hidden now existed in the open air, ready to be seen. The garage, once forbidden and distant, had become a place they stood within, its quiet presence enveloping them fully. What lay deeper inside was still unclear, its details obscured by shadow and distance. But one thing was already certain. Crossing the threshold had changed something irrevocably. There would be no returning to ignorance, no resealing of the doors that had just been forced open. The story that had been waiting behind them had begun to unfold, and they were now irrevocably part of it. Stepping farther inside did not bring the relief that might have followed the resolution of uncertainty. Instead, the sensation deepened, shifting from tension to something quieter and more profound. The garage enclosed them fully now, the open doors behind forming a distant rectangle of light that no longer felt like an invitation back, but like a reminder of where they had come from. The air inside was still, untouched by drafts, as though it had learned to remain motionless over years of careful containment. As their eyes continued to adjust, the interior revealed itself gradually, refusing to be taken in all at once. The space was larger than it had appeared from outside, its proportions carefully balanced. The walls were lined from end to end with wooden shelving, built by hand rather than assembled from factory parts. The joints were tight, the supports solid, the surfaces worn smooth by repeated contact. Everything suggested use, but not neglect. There was no sense of abandonment here, only of pause. Light entered the garage selectively, slipping through narrow gaps between boards and through a small, grimy window set high in the back wall. The beams did not flood the room, but traced it, illuminating sections while leaving others in shadow. Dust hung suspended in these shafts of light, drifting slowly, unhurried, as if even the smallest particles had adapted to the pace of the place. The smell remained constant, dry and woody, layered with the faint trace of oil and something resinous that lingered near the shelves. What struck them first was the order. Not the sterile order of a newly organized space, but a lived-in order, shaped by habit and intention. Nothing appeared random. Every surface had been considered. Tools were not scattered, but set aside neatly. Some placed in rows, others resting in shallow grooves worn into the workbench. Containers were labeled not with words, but with subtle markings and arrangements, as though the owner had known exactly what each held without needing reminders. The floor bore marks of repeated movement, narrow paths where footsteps had passed over the same ground countless times. These paths connected the shelves to the workbench to a small stool, the stool to a corner where raw materials were stacked with care. The layout was intuitive, efficient, designed by someone who understood not just the space, but the rhythm of working within it. They moved slowly, almost reluctantly, as if afraid that too much motion might disturb something delicate. Their footsteps sounded louder than expected, echoing faintly before being absorbed by the wood. The silence was not empty. It was full, dense with the presence of what had been done here. This was not a storage room, nor a place where unwanted objects were hidden away. It was a working environment, preserved in the state of its last use. As they approached the shelves, the true nature of the garage began to emerge. What they had initially taken for boxes or containers resolved into rows of small wooden forms. At first glance, they appeared uniform, their pale surfaces catching the light in soft highlights. But as they drew closer, differences became apparent. Each piece was distinct, shaped with precision and variation, its form purposeful and deliberate. These were not rough carvings or practice pieces. They were finished works, each one complete in itself. Small wooden figurines stood arranged in careful rows, their scale consistent, their craftsmanship unmistakable. The level of detail was astonishing. Faces bore expressions subtle enough to suggest emotion without exaggeration. Clothing was rendered with attention to folds and texture. Postures conveyed movement and intent, even in stillness. The realization arrived gradually, unfolding rather than striking. This was not what a garage was meant to hold. There were no signs of mechanical repair, no tools associated with vehicles or heavy labor. The space had been transformed entirely, repurposed into something closer to a studio or workshop of an artist. The discrepancy between expectation and reality created a quiet shock that settled deep and refused to dissipate. They examined the nearest figurines more closely. Each one rested on a small base, some smooth, others subtly textured. The wood varied in tone, suggesting different sources or treatments, yet the style remained consistent. The hands that had shaped these pieces had done so with remarkable control, the cuts clean and confident. This was not a hobby pursued casually or sporadically. It was the work of someone deeply committed to the craft. The arrangement of the shelves revealed another layer of intention. The figurines were grouped not by size or material, but by theme. Certain shelves held scenes rather than single figures, multiple pieces positioned together in ways that suggested interaction. Others displayed solitary forms, each isolated enough to command attention. The organization was neither decorative nor arbitrary. It followed a logic that was not immediately obvious, but felt coherent. As they moved along the wall, the sense of unease began to give way to something else. Awe, perhaps, or reverence. The garage no longer felt like a place they had forced entry into. It felt like a space that had been waiting, patient and composed, prepared to reveal itself only when the time was right. The years of secrecy surrounding it now seemed less like concealment and more like protection. The deeper they went, the more apparent it became that this environment had been maintained with extraordinary care. Surfaces were clean, not recently wiped but consistently kept. Dust had accumulated only in places that had clearly not been touched for some time, suggesting that the work had continued here until relatively recently. Nothing felt forgotten. Nothing had been left to chance. The workbench at the center of the garage drew their attention next. It stood solid and worn, its surface marked by countless fine scratches that caught the light at different angles. These marks were not signs of damage, but of use. Each one the trace of a blade guided carefully across wood. Small indentations hinted at repeated motions, habits formed over years. Nearby, tools rested in precise alignment, their handles smoothed by long familiarity. There was a quiet intimacy to the arrangement. The distance between bench and shelves, the placement of the stool, the height of the lamp mounted above the workspace, all spoke of a body that had occupied this space daily. It was easy to imagine the rhythm of work that had once filled the garage, the slow shaping of wood, the pauses, the adjustments, the return to motion. What unsettled them most was not the presence of the figurines themselves, but the absence of anything else. There were no discarded attempts, no broken pieces tossed aside. Everything here had been deemed worthy of keeping. The implication was unavoidable. Each piece mattered. Each one had been made with intention, preserved because it held significance beyond its material form. As they continued to explore, the initial shock evolved into a deeper, more complex response. This garage was not merely unexpected. It was wrong in the most profound sense of the word. Wrong not because it was unpleasant or disturbing, but because it contradicted every assumption they had carried with them. The man they had known, quiet and reserved, devoted to routine and privacy, had lived a parallel life here, one defined by creation rather than restraint. The realization carried with it a subtle sense of intrusion. Standing among these works felt like entering a private language without having been taught its grammar. The garage was not just a physical space, but an extension of its owner's inner life. Every shelf, every arrangement, every careful placement spoke of thought processes and emotions that had never been voiced aloud. The silence of the space pressed closer now, no longer neutral but expressive. It held the weight of countless hours spent alone, focused, enduring. The garage seemed to absorb sound, as though it had learned to protect concentration by muting the world beyond its walls. Even the faint noises from outside felt distant and unreal, filtered through layers of wood and memory. They stood there for a long time, moving only when necessary, absorbing the reality of what they were seeing. The forbidden place had revealed itself not as a source of danger or shame, but as something infinitely more vulnerable. It was a record of devotion, discipline, and patience, preserved in wood and silence. By the time they reached the far end of the garage, the last traces of expectation had dissolved. There was no longer any question of whether this space mattered. It mattered deeply, in ways they had not yet fully grasped. The shelves extended farther than they had first realized, disappearing briefly into shadow before re-emerging in the faint light from the back window. It was there, in that dimmer section, that they began to sense an underlying structure to the collection. The figurines were not simply arranged by theme. There was a progression, a subtle narrative unfolding along the walls. Early pieces were simpler, their forms less refined. Later ones showed increasing confidence, complexity, and emotional depth. The garage was not only a workshop, it was an archive. The understanding settled slowly, bringing with it a quiet tremor of anticipation. Whatever story this place contained had been built carefully, piece by piece, over many years. The opening of the doors had not exposed chaos or decay, but something meticulously ordered, deeply personal, and profoundly intentional. This was the wrong kind of garage, because it was never meant to hold objects. It was meant to hold memory. And now, standing within it, surrounded by the silent evidence of a life lived in careful observation, they began to realize that they had not simply discovered a hidden space. They had stepped into the beginning of a story far larger and more intimate than they had ever imagined, one that was only just beginning to reveal its shape. The longer they remained inside the garage, the clearer its internal logic became. What at first had appeared as careful order now revealed itself as something far more deliberate. The shelves did not merely hold objects, they carried sequence. The figurines, when observed patiently, formed a progression that unfolded along the walls, guiding the eye forward as though inviting the viewer to follow an invisible line. The garage was not arranged for display alone. It was arranged to be read. They began at the nearest shelf, almost unconsciously, drawn to it by proximity rather than intention. The first figures were small and simple, their forms less intricate than those deeper within the space. The carving was still precise, but the lines were softer, the details fewer. These pieces felt tentative. as though the hands that shaped them were still discovering how much could be said through wood. The scenes they depicted were modest: a lone figure standing in a yard, a pair of people seated side by side, a child holding an indistinct object close to the chest. There was restraint here, a careful economy of expression. As they moved along the shelf, the figures began to change. Details accumulated gradually, almost imperceptibly. Faces grew more defined. Postures became more expressive. Clothing took on texture and weight. It was not difficult to see that time itself was etched into these changes. The work matured as the years passed, confidence growing with repetition, patience refining skill. The realization settled slowly, bringing with it a subtle tightening in the chest. These were not random subjects. The scenes, once viewed in order, began to resonate with recognition. The small figure standing in the yard was no longer anonymous. The posture, the angle of the head, the proportions aligned too closely with memory to be coincidence. The child, holding the object, was no longer vague. The shape in its hands resolved into something familiar, something once owned, something long forgotten. The figurines were not merely representations of people. They were representations of moments. Moving farther along the shelves, the sense of recognition intensified. Scene after scene unfolded with quiet clarity, each one anchored in a specific time and place. There were no exaggerated gestures, no dramatic flourishes. Instead, the power of the work lay in its accuracy. Ordinary moments had been captured with a precision that transformed them into something enduring. A child seated at a kitchen table, legs dangling above the floor. Two figures standing beneath a tree, one slightly turned away. A small group gathered around a rectangular shape that could only be a birthday cake. The effect was overwhelming in its subtlety. These were not the memories that families typically preserve. There were no graduations, no weddings, no formal portraits. The scenes depicted the spaces between milestones, the moments that slip quietly past without announcement, yet here they were, carved carefully and preserved with reverence. As they continued along the wall, the figures multiplied, forming clusters that depicted recurring places and routines. The yard appeared again and again, transformed by seasons and time. In one scene, figures stood close together, bundled in heavy clothing, their postures angled against cold. In another, the same space was open and light, with figures positioned farther apart, relaxed, unguarded. The environment changed subtly around them, trees thickening, fences weathering, details accumulating in ways that mirrored reality with uncanny accuracy. The garage had become a silent chronicle of family life, rendered not through words or photographs, but through wood and patient observation. Each figure carried the weight of time spent watching, remembering, translating memory into form. The hands that had carved these pieces had not rushed. They had lingered over details that only someone deeply attentive could have noticed. They reached a section of shelving that seemed more densely populated than the rest. Here, the figurines were arranged in longer sequences, their placement suggesting continuity rather than isolation. Scenes flowed into one another, depicting growth and change with quiet inevitability. The children in these carvings grew taller, their proportions shifting, their postures straightening. The playful looseness of early scenes gave way to moments of concentration, of inward focus. There were depictions of learning and effort. A figure bent over a book, shoulders slightly hunched. Another balancing uncertainly on a two-wheeled shape, arms extended for stability. A third, seated alone, gaze directed outward rather than toward any visible object. These scenes carried a different emotional weight, capturing not just action, but internal states that had once passed unnoticed. The realization became unavoidable. The garage did not simply contain representations of family members. It contained their lives, observed closely and recorded faithfully. The person who had created these works had been paying attention in a way few ever do, noticing not only what happened but how it felt. As they moved deeper into the space, the scenes expanded to include other figures. Adults appeared more frequently now, their features rendered with increasing specificity. There was a woman standing at a counter, hands engaged in a task suggested by posture alone. Another seated beneath a tree, body relaxed, attention turned inward. A man positioned behind a circular form, hands placed as though gripping something unseen. Each figure was unmistakable, even without exaggerated detail. Their identities were conveyed through stance, proportion, and context rather than facial exactness. What struck them most was the absence of idealization. These figures were not flattering. They were honest. Lines were carved where lines existed. Postures reflected habit rather than intention. There was no attempt to present anyone as better or worse than they had been. The wood held them as they were, without judgment. The chronology continued, advancing steadily toward the present. Clothing styles shifted subtly. Objects appeared that belonged to later years, replacing those from earlier scenes. Technology entered the carvings cautiously. Its presence suggested rather than emphasized. A rectangular object held close to the body. A table cleared of certain familiar items, replaced by others. The changes were quiet but unmistakable, marking the passage of decades without a single written date. They found themselves slowing further, their movements almost reverent now. Each shelf demanded attention, and each figure seemed to insist on being seen fully, understood on its own terms. The garage no longer felt like a space they were exploring. It felt like a space that was revealing itself deliberately, trusting them to follow its pace. In the far corner, the lighting shifted again, becoming softer and more diffuse. Here, the shelves held fewer figures, but the ones that remained carried a different kind of intensity. The scenes were simpler, their compositions more restrained, yet the emotional resonance was stronger. Two figures seated close together, not touching, but aligned. A solitary figure standing at the edge of a space, gaze directed outward. A group gathered around an unseen focal point, their attention unified. These scenes felt reflective, as though they had been carved not in the moment they depicted, but afterward, shaped by memory rather than immediacy. The difference was subtle but perceptible. The earlier works had captured life as it unfolded. These later pieces seemed to look back, their stillness heavy with contemplation. The sense of being observed grew stronger. It became clear that the creator of these works had not simply documented events. He had interpreted them, selecting moments that held meaning beyond their apparent simplicity. The garage was not a neutral record. It was a personal archive shaped by affection, concern, and a deep desire to remember. By the time they reached the end of the longest shelf, the emotional weight of the discovery had become almost unbearable. The realization that someone had devoted so much time and care to preserving these moments, all in silence, without acknowledgement or praise, pressed heavily against the chest. This had not been done for recognition. It had been done out of necessity, as though memory itself had demanded a physical form. The final figures on that shelf depicted scenes that felt unfinished. The subjects were older now, their postures more settled, their movements less impulsive. Yet there was a sense of anticipation in these carvings, a quiet, forward-looking quality that distinguished them from the rest. They did not feel like conclusions. They felt like pauses. Standing there, surrounded by this wooden chronicle, the full significance of the garage began to take shape. It was not merely a workshop or a hidden room. It was a life's work, constructed slowly and deliberately, piece by piece. Every figure was a sentence. Every shelf was a chapter. Together, they formed a narrative that had been written without words, preserved without witness. The silence of the space deepened, no longer empty, but resonant. The garage held decades within its walls, and now those decades pressed gently outward, demanding recognition. What had once been forbidden was revealed not as something dangerous or shameful, but as something fragile, vulnerable, and profoundly human. They remained there for a long time, unwilling to move on too quickly. The story unfolding around them deserved patience. It deserved to be taken in fully, without haste. Yet, even as they lingered, a quiet awareness began to form. This chronicle, for all its depth and completeness, was not finished. There were gaps that demanded explanation, choices that hinted at sacrifice, and a silence that still surrounded the man who had created it. The wooden figures had shown them what had been seen and remembered. They had not yet revealed why it had all been hidden away, nor what it had cost to create. Those answers lay elsewhere within the garage, waiting beyond the shelves, in the deeper heart of the space where work had continued long after recognition had ceased. The chronicle had been opened. Now it was time to understand the hand that had written it. The understanding born among the shelves did not settle easily. It lingered in the air like dust disturbed by sudden light, refusing to fall back into place. The wooden chronicle had revealed what had been seen and remembered, but it had not explained the silence that surrounded its creation. Standing there, surrounded by decades of patient work, they felt the weight of an unanswered question pressing steadily inward. Why had this been hidden? Why had a man capable of such devotion and precision chosen secrecy over sharing, isolation over recognition? Their attention drifted away from the shelves almost instinctively, drawn toward the center of the garage where the workbench stood. It was not placed there for convenience alone. It was the axis around which the entire space had been arranged. Everything led back to it. The paths worn into the floor, the orientation of the shelves, the placement of the light. This was where the chronicle had taken shape, where raw material had been transformed into memory. Up close, the bench revealed itself as a landscape of use rather than age. The wood of its surface was scarred with countless fine marks, shallow grooves that followed no random pattern. Each cut traced the path of a blade guided with care. Some lines were straight and decisive, others curved gently, adjusting to the resistance of grain and knot. Together they formed a record of motion, of hands returning again and again to the same place, refining gesture through repetition. The tools resting upon it were arranged with an intimacy that spoke of long familiarity. Knives of varying lengths lay side by side, their handles polished smooth by years of contact. Chisels stood upright in a narrow rack, their edges carefully honed, free of rust. Small files and rasps were aligned precisely, their teeth clean. Nothing here suggested haste or neglect. Each tool had been maintained not as an object but as a companion to work. Nearby, containers held materials prepared in advance. Blocks of wood were stacked by size and type, their surfaces marked faintly with symbols or notches that indicated purpose rather than measurement. Some pieces were raw and untouched, others partially shaped, their outlines suggesting figures yet to be completed. The presence of these unfinished forms introduced a new tension, one that had not existed among the completed works on the shelves. They examined these pieces carefully. Each represented a moment interrupted, a thought paused mid-sentence. In some, the general silhouette had been established, but finer details remained absent. In others, the face was fully formed while the hands were still rough, waiting. These were not abandoned attempts. They were works in progress, left exactly as they had been at the last moment of use. Among them, one piece stood apart. It rested closer to the edge of the bench, positioned where the light fell most directly. Unlike the others, it was nearly complete. Two figures stood side by side, their bodies aligned in a shared direction. Their features were unmistakably those of adults, their proportions settled and assured. The resemblance was immediate and unsettling. These figures represented them not as children preserved in memory, but as they were now. The realization struck with quiet force. This had not been carved from recollection alone. It had been shaped from observation that continued into recent years. The hands that had worked this piece had done so while aware of who they had become, of the distance that had grown between visits, of the time that had passed without announcement. The chronicle had not ended with childhood. It had reached forward, refusing to stop at the point where memory became harder to maintain. The presence of this unfinished piece transformed the atmosphere of the garage. What had felt like a completed archive now revealed itself as something still in motion, something that had been interrupted rather than concluded. The sense of pause that lingered over the final shelves found its physical counterpart here, in this figure that stood waiting. Their gaze moved upward from the bench to the wall behind it, where a few items had been pinned with care. Among them was a photograph, its edges curled slightly with age. The image depicted their grandfather as a younger man, his posture upright, his expression focused but unguarded. He stood beside a wooden sculpture larger than any of the figures they had seen so far, his hands resting lightly on its surface. There was pride in the image, not the loud kind, but a quiet satisfaction rooted in effort. Next to the photograph was a yellowed newspaper clipping, its paper brittle, the ink faded but still legible. It spoke of a local exhibition held decades earlier, of artisans and craftsmen gathered to display their work. Their grandfather's name appeared there, printed clearly, accompanied by praise that felt incongruous with the man they had known. The article described his skill with reverence, noting the emotional depth and technical mastery of his carvings. It spoke of promise, of recognition earned through discipline and talent. Then came the line that shifted everything. The article mentioned a condition, described in careful, clinical terms. A degenerative illness affecting the hands, progressive and unpredictable. The prognosis was cautious but firm. Continued fine work, the doctors had advised, could accelerate the damage, leading to pain, loss of mobility, and eventual inability to work at all. For a craftsman whose art depended on precision, the warning was devastating. Reading those words reframed the entire garage. The silence, the secrecy, the absence of recognition all took on new meaning. Their grandfather had not withdrawn from public life out of indifference or humility. He had been forced to choose between preservation and sacrifice. Faced with the possibility of losing his hands entirely, he had stepped away from the world that praised him, not because he had lost love for his craft, but because he could not bear to lose the ability to practice it at all. Yet the tools before them told a different story. The shelves full of figures contradicted the notion of abandonment. He had not stopped carving. He had simply changed his audience. The secrecy of the garage, once interpreted as exclusion, now revealed itself as protection. This was not a space meant to hide something shameful. It was a refuge, a place where he could continue working without scrutiny, without expectation, without the pressure to perform for anyone but himself. The prohibition placed upon it during their childhood was not an act of distance, but of preservation. He had guarded this space fiercely because it held the only version of his craft that remained possible. Understanding this reframed his strictness in memory, the firmness of his rules, the quiet authority with which he enforced them, now appeared not as control but as defense. He had protected this place not only from intrusion, but from interruption, from the demands of explanation he was not prepared to give. The garage was where he could endure pain privately, transforming it into something meaningful rather than allowing it to define him. The emotional weight of this realization settled slowly, pressing against years of misunderstanding. The man they had known had carried this burden alone, choosing silence over sympathy, creation over complaint. The wooden figures lining the shelves were not merely acts of remembrance, they were acts of resistance. Each one represented a choice to continue, to carve meaning from limitation rather than surrender to it. The unfinished works gained new significance in this light. They were not signs of neglect or loss of interest. They were evidence of a struggle that had continued until it could no longer be sustained. The nearly completed figures of the two adults stood as a testament to that persistence, to a belief in the future that had endured even as the body weakened. The garage, once perceived as a forbidden place, now revealed itself as a sanctuary built out of necessity. It was the only space where he could remain whole, where his identity as a craftsman and observer could survive without compromise. The secrecy that had surrounded it was not meant to create distance, but to preserve integrity. Standing there, the silence of the garage felt different. It was no longer heavy with concealment. It was heavy with endurance. Every surface bore witness to a man who had chosen to keep working despite pain, to keep watching despite distance, to keep remembering even as time threatened to erode everything he loved. The chronicle on the shelves had shown them the what. The bench, the tools, the photograph, and the article had revealed the why. Together, they formed a truth far more complex and intimate than anything they had imagined. Their grandfather had not simply preserved their family's life in wood. He had preserved himself within it, embedding his own struggle into every careful cut. The realization left them standing in stillness, surrounded by evidence of a love expressed not through words or presence, but through quiet, relentless creation. The garage was no longer a place of mystery. It was a place of sacrifice, resilience, and devotion. And in that understanding, a new responsibility began to take shape, one that would demand a response equal to the gift they had been given. The weight of understanding did not lift when the truth became clear. It deepened. What they had uncovered at the workbench did not bring closure, but rather opened a new space within them, one that demanded reflection rather than relief. The garage, once silent in a neutral way, now felt charged with presence. Every object seemed to lean inward, as though aware of having been finally seen. The shelves no longer appeared static. They felt like witnesses, holding their positions patiently while the meaning of their existence settled into place. Their attention returned again and again to the unfinished figures on the workbench. Among them, the near-complete carving of the two adults exerted a pull that was impossible to resist. It was not merely resemblance that made it unsettling, but timing. This piece existed in the present tense. It had been shaped not from distant memory, but from recent observation. The hands that carved it had known who they were now, how they stood, how they carried themselves, how time had changed them. This was not a grandfather remembering children. This was a man watching adults, still attentive, still invested. They examined the figures more closely, noting details that could not have been accidental. The angle of the shoulders, a subtle difference in height, the way each figure faced forward rather than toward the other. There was intention in that choice. It suggested not separation, but parallel movement. Two lives unfolding side by side, connected by origin rather than proximity. The figures were not interacting, yet they belonged together. They shared a direction, a future implied rather than defined. The carving was unfinished in ways that felt deliberate rather than incomplete. The outlines were clear, the forms established, yet certain details remained untouched. The faces were present, but lacked final refinement. The hands were shaped but not yet expressive. It was as though the Creator had paused at the edge of definition, unwilling to impose a conclusion on something that was still unfolding. The future had been acknowledged, but not fixed. This realization carried a quiet emotional force. Their grandfather had not only recorded what had been, he had anticipated what might still come. Even as his body weakened, even as pain and limitation pressed in, he had continued to look forward. The unfinished carving was not evidence of defeat. It was evidence of belief. The sense of guilt that rose within them was immediate and uninvited. It was not tied to any single action or absence, but to the accumulation of distance that had grown naturally over time. Visits had become less frequent. Conversations had shortened. Life had expanded outward, pulling them into responsibilities and routines that left little space for reflection. Yet, here was proof that, despite that distance, they had remained present in his mind. He had continued to watch, to notice, to care, without asking anything in return. The garage no longer felt like a place of discovery. It felt like a place of reckoning. The truth they had uncovered demanded more than acknowledgement. It demanded response. The question was no longer why this had been hidden, but what should be done with what had been revealed. They moved slowly through the space once more, their perspective altered. The shelves they had studied before now appeared transformed by context. Each figure represented not just memory, but effort. Each scene was the result of time stolen from pain, of focus maintained despite discomfort. The cumulative weight of that effort was staggering. Thousands of hours had been spent here, not in pursuit of recognition, but in quiet dedication to something deeply personal. The garage itself seemed to echo this devotion. Its order, its cleanliness, its careful maintenance all spoke of respect. This was not a space used casually or occasionally. It had been central to his existence. The secrecy that had once felt like exclusion now revealed itself as vulnerability. This was where he had been most exposed, most himself. To share it would have been to invite scrutiny into something he was not prepared to explain. Standing there, they began to understand that the garage was not merely a record of the past. It was a message. Not one written in words, but one shaped slowly and patiently, intended to be discovered only when the time was right. The timing mattered. Had they found this place earlier, they might not have understood it. They might have seen only the craftsmanship, the novelty, the surprise. Now, with loss still fresh and memory sharpened by absence, the message carried its full weight. The realization brought with it a shift in how they perceived their grandfather. The strictness they remembered, the reserve, the emotional distance he sometimes maintained, all took on new meaning. Those traits were not barriers meant to keep others out. They were structures he had built to hold himself together. His love had not been loud or demonstrative, but it had been constant and precise, expressed through action rather than speech. The unfinished future represented by the carving on the bench stood as a quiet challenge. It asked whether what had been begun here would simply end, or whether it would be carried forward. The tools remained, carefully maintained, waiting. The raw materials were still present, prepared for use. Nothing in the garage suggested finality. Even in its stillness, the space felt oriented toward continuation. They considered the implications of leaving everything as it was. The house would eventually be emptied. The property would change hands. Without intervention, the garage would become just another neglected structure, its contents vulnerable to decay, loss, or disposal. The thought was unbearable. What had been created here could not be reduced to objects to be sold or discarded. It was too personal, too intentional, too bound to identity. A sense of responsibility began to form, not imposed from outside, but emergent naturally from understanding. This was not about obligation in the legal sense. It was about inheritance in the truest meaning of the word. What they had received was not property, but perspective. A way of seeing, of remembering, of valuing the ordinary moments that make up a life. Their gaze returned once more to the unfinished figures. The absence of final detail now felt purposeful, almost generous. It left room. The future had not been carved because it was not his to define. He had brought it to the threshold and stopped, trusting that someone else would take the next step. The emotional intensity of that trust was overwhelming. It suggested faith not only in their existence, but in their capacity to continue, to add rather than simply preserve. The chronicle on the shelves documented what had been. The unfinished carving acknowledged what was. Together, they pointed toward what could still be made. The garage, once forbidden and distant, now felt intimately connected to their own sense of self. It was no longer a relic of the past, but a living question. How would they honor what had been given? How would they ensure that this act of love did not fade into silence once more? The answer did not arrive all at once. It emerged gradually, shaped by emotion rather than logic. They would not allow this place to disappear. They would not treat it as a curiosity or a burden. They would take responsibility for it, not by freezing it in time, but by allowing it to continue in some form. The tools would not remain unused. The materials would not remain untouched. The story that had begun here would not end with discovery alone. It would move forward, carried by hands that understood its origin and respected its purpose. As this realization took hold, the garage felt different once more. The silence no longer pressed inward. It opened outward, expansive rather than heavy. The space no longer seemed to hold its breath. It seemed to release it. The unfinished future, once a source of quiet sorrow, now appeared as an invitation. The chapter that had begun with secrecy and endurance had reached its turning point. What remained was action, shaped not by urgency, but by care. The garage had given them its truth. Now it waited, patient as it had always been, to see what they would do with it. The decision, once fully formed, did not announce itself with drama. It settled quietly, with the same deliberate certainty that seemed to define everything within the garage. There was no sense of urgency, no frantic need to act immediately. Instead, a steady resolve took shape, grounded in understanding rather than impulse. The garage no longer felt like a place they had intruded upon. It felt like a responsibility that had been passed to them without ceremony, entrusted rather than imposed. They began by preparing the figurines for removal, though even this task carried a weight that demanded care. Each piece was handled slowly, lifted with both hands, examined one last time before being wrapped. Cloth was chosen for its softness rather than convenience, folded carefully around each carving to protect edges worn smooth by time. The process was methodical, almost ritualistic, as though speed itself would be a form of disrespect. Nothing here was treated as an object. Everything was treated as testimony. As shelves gradually emptied, the scale of what had been created became even more apparent. Gaps appeared where rows of figures had once stood, exposing pale outlines in the wood where bases had rested for years. These marks were not damage. They were impressions left by presence, subtle reminders that something meaningful had occupied that space for a long time. The garage looked different as it emptied, but it did not feel diminished. If anything, the absence sharpened the significance of what had been there. They organized the figurines not by convenience, but by the logic already embedded in the collection. Scenes that belonged together were kept together. Chronological order was preserved. Even the unfinished pieces were given special attention, placed where they would remain undisturbed. The near-complete carving of the two adults was wrapped last, handled with particular care, as though acknowledging its unique position between past and future. Throughout the process, the atmosphere of the garage continued to shift. The silence that had once felt heavy now felt gentle, accommodating. Sunlight moved slowly across the floor as the day progressed, illuminating areas that had been in shadow earlier, then retreating again. The space seemed to accept what was happening, offering no resistance, as though this transition had been anticipated. Before leaving, they paused at the workbench once more. The tools remained exactly where they had been left, their alignment undisturbed. There was no sense of finality in their presence. They did not feel like relics. They felt ready. The handles bore the marks of long use, shaped by hands that had known them intimately. Picking one up felt natural, not forbidden. The weight was familiar, balanced, designed to work with the body rather than against it. The realization that followed was quiet but profound. What their grandfather had left behind was not only the result of his labor, but the means to continue it. He had preserved not just memory, but method. The tools, the materials, the arrangement of the space all suggested intention. He had not closed the door on his craft. He had simply paused, trusting that someone else might one day open it again. They gathered the tools as well, wrapping them with the same care afforded to the figurines. Each blade was protected, each handle secured. This, too, felt like an act of acknowledgement rather than possession. The garage was being emptied, but it was not being erased. Its essence was being transferred, carried forward into a new context where it could continue to live. When they finally stepped outside, the light had begun to soften. The yard, still overgrown and uneven, appeared less oppressive than before. The trees no longer leaned inward with the same weight. The garage, now open and partially emptied, did not retreat into shadow as it had before. Its doors stood wide, revealing an interior stripped of secrecy, but not of meaning. The house awaited its own fate, but it no longer felt like the center of what mattered. The true inheritance had been found elsewhere, in a space that had existed quietly alongside their lives, unseen but constant. What they carried with them now was not merely a collection of carved figures, but a way of seeing the world that valued attention over spectacle, patience over haste. In the days that followed, plans took shape naturally. A space would be set aside where the figurines could be displayed, not as art for admiration, but as a living archive. The arrangement would follow the same logic as the garage, preserving sequence and connection. This would not be a static exhibition. It would be a place of storytelling, where future generations could trace their origins through scenes rendered not by camera or record, but by hand and memory. They imagined children standing before the figures one day, recognizing themselves in early forms, learning that their lives were worth noticing even in their smallest moments. They imagined explaining how these pieces had been made, not quickly or easily, but patiently, through years of careful observation and quiet dedication. The story of their grandfather would be told not as a tale of loss or sacrifice alone, but as an example of how love could be transformed into something tangible and enduring. The idea of continuing the work no longer felt abstract. It felt necessary. Learning to carve would not be about replicating his skill or matching his precision. It would be about honoring his approach, watching closely, remembering intentionally, choosing moments that mattered not because they were extraordinary, but because they were real. The craft would become a way of staying present, of resisting the erosion of attention that time inevitably brings. The unfinished carving of the two adults would remain unfinished, at least for now. It would stand as a reminder that the future cannot be defined by another's hand. It belonged to those who would live it. One day, perhaps, it would be completed, or perhaps it would remain as it was, a testament to faith rather than conclusion. As evening settled over the property, the last of the work was completed. The garage stood empty but not hollow. Its walls retained the quiet imprint of years of devotion. Closing the doors did not feel like sealing something away again. It felt like a respectful farewell, a promise rather than an ending. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard. Light caught briefly on the wood of the house, on the leaves of the trees, on the closed doors of the garage. For a moment, everything seemed aligned, past and present overlapping without conflict. The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was calm. They left the property carrying more than they had arrived with. They carried responsibility, understanding, and a renewed sense of connection. What had once been a secret was now a legacy, no longer confined to a hidden space but integrated into the ongoing story of the family. The love that had shaped those wooden figures had not ended with their creator's life. It had been preserved, transferred, and now, finally, acknowledged. It would continue, not because it was demanded, but because it had been freely given. The garage had fulfilled its purpose. The story it held would move forward, shaped by new hands, guided by old values, and carried into the future with the same quiet devotion that had given it life. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. More hidden stories, forgotten lives, and unexpected discoveries are already waiting for you in our other videos. Watch the next one now, explore the rest of the channel, and share this video with someone who believes